G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 Fantasy video. Today we are looking at your drafts for your F1 Fantasy lineups. So if you're new around here, you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, be sure to do so because there is going to be plenty more F1 Fantasy content as we approach Bahrain race week. I thought this would be a pretty opportune time to cobble together a video looking at your team selections, given that firstly F1 is putting out a lot of F1 fantasy content on Twitter. As you can see here, Carlos Sainz is opining on whether or not he is value for money in the fantasy landscape, but also because my team selection videos are usually a staple of my fantasy content week in, week out. So I thought, why not take a look at some of your teams instead for a change? Piece together, what seems to work, what doesn't. I'll give you some opinions and thoughts on the lineups that will be popular and maybe some alternatives to builds you might not have considered already. So before I get into the data that I analyzed, I took a sample of almost 40 teams that were submitted to me on Twitter. But I wanted to thank each and every one of you on the screen here that responded to my tweet on Twitter asking for fantasy lineups. I wanted to look at ownership percentages and just analyze the trends and popular approaches to how teams are constructed in the game at the moment, given that prices are very different to how they were 12 months ago, and whether or not there's a clear template or two in place as we approach the first race of the season, given preseason testing has now concluded. So thanks again to everyone on screen here, because this video obviously wouldn't be possible without you guys. So we'll get stuck into driver ownership first of all. Alex Albon topped all drivers with 77.1% owned. He is the highest owned fantasy asset in the game at the moment. But below 77%, in the 60s at the time of recording. But I still think 77% is very, very high. Definitely higher than I expected. Is he 77% owned? Like, is he that good that 77% of people want him? He might be. He's in my team, and I wouldn't say I'm completely not clued into the fantasy landscape at the moment, but I still think, at 7 million in the game at the moment, we saw what he was able to do in the Williams, not just last year, but in 2022 as well. He is value for money, and certainly in terms of the other assets kind of around that price point, outstrips the stake assets, Logan Sargent, the Haas assets, perhaps even the Alpine duo that are priced more than Alex Albon. So, I think he becomes a very good budget enabler, and certainly has factored into a lot of teams given his very affordable price point. So look for Alex Albon as a prime budget enabler if you're struggling to cobble together a team and you're short on cash. Max Verstappen at 74.3%. Probably unsurprising to me, given the fact that he's going to be the #1 DRS boost option week in, week out. He's certainly going to be the first name on my team sheet heading into Bahrain, and he was also the highest scoring driver in 17 of the 22 races in 2023. So I think he's going to be a popular pick for a reason, and I really like him as a DRS boost option compared to a number of other drivers, purely just because of that consistency and reliability factor. I don't think he'll go every race without a DNF like he did last year, but I certainly think it'll be 1 to 2 DNFs max for him this season, pardon the pun, just because of how cohesive that Red Bull unit is, how reliable that car is, and obviously just because of how, smart and how good Max's racecraft is as well. I'm not going to go through every single name on the list here, but I think Yuki, Pierre, Daniel, Charles, all drivers that are in the template at the moment, all the popular lineups, or certainly the ones I'm seeing on Twitter at the very least, seem to encompass a combination of these drivers owned at above 37%. I think the most surprising thing I took away from this analysis was that not a single Mercedes driver featured in the 40 lineups that I reviewed. No Russell and no Lewis Hamilton. Now, George Russell is owned by only 8% of all fantasy strategists in the official game, so I would expect his ownership in this sample size to also be quite low, but Lewis is owned by 21%. Now, to see him not in a single team surprised me a little bit. I appreciate that Mercedes maybe isn't at the same level that Ferrari and Red Bull are based on what we saw in preseason, which I know is not the be-all and end-all for fantasy decision-making, and certainly not to gauge how a team is expected to perform throughout the season. But to see Lewis in not a single team, he's won seven world championships. He was one of the highest scoring fantasy drivers last year, even if he wasn't perhaps value for money throughout the year. So to see him not in a single team definitely took me aback a little bit. I definitely think Mercedes will be strong out of the gates this season, unlike last year where they only managed one podium up until Monaco. But again, given the fact that McLaren, Ferrari have made great strides forward in the development, maybe that is just enough to neglect people for going for Lewis Hamilton, certainly in the first couple of races of the season. Now, in terms of constructors, RB, the most popular asset in the game, 71.4%. I think up until testing, I had them on par with Alpine, who were also pretty much the same price as RB, as the midfield constructor that would be paired most easily with a premium constructor in Ferrari or Red Bull or even Mercedes. Now, obviously, preseason testing has influenced a number of people's decision-making process. Ferrari and Red Bull equally own 45.7%. And as we saw last season, as was the trend with, say, Red Bull or Ferrari out of the gates, they were typically paired with a more affordable constructor from the outset. Aston Martin was that team in the first half of the season. And then as our budget increased, as Aston Martin's upgrades regressed and McLaren entered the conversation for a template pick, they became the second constructor to pair with Red Bull. Now, I fully expect RB is going to be that team this season. And Alpine, given they served up something like a tractor in testing, or at least that's what some people are expecting, that's perhaps why their ownership is so low in this 40-team sample size. I thought Ferrari might be a little higher and Red Bull a little lower, purely because of the fact that people can sometimes overreact to testing. But notwithstanding that, I think Red Bull and their ownership is going to be largely dependent on Sergio Perez. And we're going to get into that a little more in the video when we look at a few of the drafts that have been submitted. But I think if Perez is going to be king of the street circuits, podium sitter every race week, that kind of Checo Perez, then their ownership's going to spike. If it's out in Q1, if it's DNF prone Checo, then I think their ownership is going to drop off. But I guess we'll have to wait and see what the practice sessions on Thursday and Friday reveal, because right now I couldn't split the two, and I'm certainly agonizing over two team builds we'll get to in a minute that encompass both of those constructors. In terms of the rest of the group, everyone else is below 10%. I think Aston Martin's probably one that surprised me a little bit to be at 8.6. I thought they might be a little bit higher, but they did say they weren't showing all their cards in testing. And I know Alonso is a very, very viable asset to own as a driver, but I think the Lance Stroll concern around his consistency and reliability is another thing altogether. If he can string together those consistent performances we saw in the last 6 races of 2023 fantasy-wise, then I certainly think they come onto the fantasy radar. But if he's the out in Q1, doesn't really make many overtakes or positions gained, that becomes a problem. If he's in a car that for some reason he still doesn't make it out of Q1, but can make up 5 to 10 positions gained and overtakes in a race, that's 20 points in your pocket right there. But Stroll has been known to be rocks and diamonds throughout the season in just any given year. So I'd need to see a bit more from him before I'd absolutely speak to Aston Martin as a template constructor. As for the rest of the guys, 5.7 and below, I wouldn't really go near, to be honest. Alpine, as I said, not a very fast car at the moment. Sauber, Haas, Williams, I wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. And then McLaren just aren't value for money when we're seeing Ferrari, Mercedes, for instance, just deliver and seem to show a little bit more so far. They might have a bit more to reveal in the free practice sessions, but right now McLaren for me, drivers and constructors alike, are a no-go at the moment. So I want to take a look at 4 different drafts, 2 that are more template focused and 2 that are perhaps not quite as much. But the first one here is one I've been grappling with. I really like the balance you've got with Max Verstappen, Leclerc, Tsunoda, Gasly, Albon, Ferrari Constructor, and RB. I put every single one of these drafts into F1 Fantasy Tools Team Calculator, and this came out with 185.6 points for the Bahrain Grand Prix. Now, I would take those metrics with a grain of salt, partially because of the fact that I think Ferrari, for instance, are going to be a bit more value for money this year. I think the AlphaTauri/RB is going to be a step forward from where they were 12 months ago. And I also think that the Ferrari Constructor as well is a lot more affordable than what we saw in 2023, not to mention that they are going to be the closest team to rival Red Bull from the outset. Now, I think in terms of Red Bull, Max Verstappen, first name on my team sheet, the obvious DRS boost candidate. But I think as well, there's a lot of value to unlock in RB, in Yuki Tsunoda, Alex Albon. I think they're all value for money, maybe even on the underpriced side a tad. Now, Pierre Gasly is probably the only one after testing that I've maybe got a little bit of cold feet on at the moment, but I still think he is an experienced driver that can make overtakes. He averaged 5 overtakes a race in 2023, and I definitely think the Alpine, even if it is a bit slow out of the gates, can certainly, at 7.8, is a team, or Gasly and Ocon at least, are drivers that you can get into your team pretty easily at that price point. I think RB as a constructor, again, there isn't really much else in that price bracket that entertains me, or at least makes me want to go for them, unless out of nowhere Alpine become a factor. But I just really like the well-roundedness, the balance of this team. And look, if you're planning on playing your DRS, the extra DRS boost chip in the first sprint race of the season in China, then having the 3 times on Max and the 2 times on Charles also becomes a really nice 1-2 punch there. But I guess if you're not looking to play the DRS boost or the extra DRS boost option in the first sprint race or 2 of the season, that's where I like draft number 2 a little bit more. The only difference here is you're taking out Leclerc and Ferrari for Ricciardo and Red Bull. I did see in a couple of drafts, some people had Stroll in favor of Ricciardo. And for this draft and the last draft, these were the 2 most popular submissions. And I think the template is going somewhere in that direction for the first race week of the season, purely because of the fact that Max is going to be the most popular DRS boost option. As I've said, Tsunoda and Albon, budget enablers of sorts, RB, another constructor in the midfield that pairs nicely with a premium constructor, as I talked about. But I think Red Bull in your team, super powerful, really, you know what you're going to get from Max. He's going to deliver 50 points for the constructor most race weeks, at least. It really comes down to whether or not Perez, as I said earlier, is going to be able to consistently perform week in, week out. If he's going to put that car kind of around P2, P3 every race, that suddenly makes Red Bull Racing at 27.9, maybe even a tad underpriced. But a lot of that does depend on his consistency and reliability. If he is prone to DNFs and going out in Q1, Q2, then that really reduces the points potential the Red Bull constructor has. But I still think it is a very popular option. And also, it makes it easier. Let's say, for instance, Red Bull look really good in the first couple races of the season. Perez and Max are firing on all cylinders as the strongest car in the field. They're a second ahead of their rivals. Then getting up to Red Bull from Ferrari is a lot more difficult than going from Red Bull down to Ferrari. I think you're going to have to realistically think about whether or not, if Red Bull look good and you don't own them, if you can get up there easily enough. You don't want to carry, 7 or 8 million in the bank in the first race week of the season. I think having maybe 1 to 2 million is prudent. But if you start with Ferrari and Red Bull look good, it's very hard to move to them without making 2 trades off the rip. And you might find that there might be another driver or 2 in your team that you don't like. You might be putting out other fires you hadn't anticipated for Saudi Arabia. Let's say Gasly and Alpine are trundling last in Bahrain, and you don't like the look of them for the foreseeable future. That's 3 trades off the bat if you're also looking to move out Leclerc and Ferrari and bring in Red Bull Racing and Daniel Ricciardo or Lance Stroll in that second driver slot next to Max. So just something to think about. I think having a bit of flexibility to make moves or easily plan out your moves 1 or 2 weeks ahead is always going to be beneficial, particularly if things change out of the blue that you hadn't anticipated. So I really like this. You've got coverage of Max and Red Bull, and if you think Max is going to do well, which I think he absolutely is more often than not, then having Red Bull Racing to supplement that is always going to be a huge benefit too. Now, the next 2 drafts are probably less template, given the first 2 we looked at were the most popular ones that were submitted. This one still has Max as the 2 times point multiplier, but instead of running 1 premium constructor and 1 mid-price constructor, we have 2 premium constructors in Ferrari and Mercedes. Now, I wouldn't typically start my team with this particular build in the first race week of the season. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But I will shout out F1 Visionary, who submitted this draft. Was the only draft submitted in this particular format and lineup. But of the 4 teams that I submitted into F1 Fantasy Tools to get a points projection, this one actually scored the highest. Came out at 195.4 points. And among the premium constructors that are not Red Bull, Ferrari and Mercedes are my two picks. I think in F1 Fantasy, the name of the game is to own at least one premium constructor. You get most of your points, or a big chunk of your points, from premium constructors. So having at least one that you know is going to score pretty well every weekend is pretty important. And then having Max as well there is a pretty powerful combination. So look at the rest of your team, see what else you can manipulate to build that out. But as you can see here, Sonoda, Ricciardo and Albon, three very affordable drivers that we've seen in the previous two drafts that I also really like. I won't continually speak about them, but they are all very much value for money. I think they all have fantasy upside based on their price points. And realistically are probably the best drivers if you're trying to fill your team out, given you've got two premium constructors. Now, Mercedes interests me a lot. I think Ferrari at the moment are probably a little bit more value for money, but I still like both of them ahead of McLaren. I just don't know about Mercedes because some people are saying they're going to be right up there with Ferrari on race pace, close to Red Bull as well. Other people are saying they're going to be another step or two back from Ferrari, McLaren and Red Bull, and they're going to be fighting it out with Aston Martin for P4. So I'm really not quite sure. Andrew Chauvelin is very optimistic about Mercedes. Toto's spoken very highly of them as well, and Lewis and George are very confident compared to where they were a year ago, given the fact that they expect that this is a great baseline. They're able to make upgrades more seamlessly and compete for podiums from the outset rather than warm up for kind of 4 to 8 races and then suddenly start competing at the front. So I think, there's certainly some upside for the Silver Arrows. But I'm going to have to wait for practice to be convinced in Bahrain for Mercedes at the moment. I still think they've got the fundamentals in place. Just want to see something on paper before I suddenly take a bite out of their tree. Bottas is the only other one that I hadn't really talked about on this screen here. The one thing I'll say about Sauber is I want to see a bit more from them as well. They are expected to rival Haas at the back of the field. Some people are saying, P10 in the Constructors is certainly not outside the realms of possibility for them either. So I appreciate that in the race simulation and qualifying simulation data that Lawrence Barretto published on F1 recently, that there may be a case that they could be around P7, but I want to see tangible results from Sauber, from Joe and Bottas before I suddenly start entertaining them as an idea and as an asset in my fantasy team. Otherwise, I really like this as a double kind of a 1-2 punch premium constructor build if you're going without Red Bull as that premium constructor in your team. The last draft I want to look at is a non-max build, and I appreciate that some people are certainly considering it. It wouldn't be the most template approach going around, but interestingly enough, the non-max constructor builds on F1 Fantasy Tools are some of the highest at the moment. There are also people that have reached out to me and said, I'm in leagues where I'm not allowed to run Max Verstappen, given he's always going to be the highest scorer, or more often than not anyway. So I really like this draft that was submitted by Apple Peer on Twitter. I think the question you need to ask yourself, if you're in a league where going with or without Max is not a problem, is it worthwhile going without Max Verstappen? Now, the case I'll make for Max is that he will consistently score 30 to 40 points at least on non-sprint race weekends. I think Perez, when he's on form, or any other DRS boost option, whether it's Hamilton, Leclerc, Norris, etc., they will certainly score 30 to 40 points when they're winning the race, or if they're P2 with a driver of the day in there. But can they do it consistently over the course of a season? I'm not so sure they can. I think Max obviously can, best driver in the best car, but Perez ebbed and flowed a lot last season. So I'm not really sure if there's going to be the max level of consistency from Perez. We might have the odd race here and there like we did last season where he outscores Verstappen, but I don't think Perez is going to suddenly become a 30 to 40 point scorer every single race week. So I think you really need to think about whether or not, if you're going to make trades to try and chase the DRS boost option that's not Max for the highest points every week, if you think that's worth it. But let's assume Perez, he's scoring 20 to 30 points, or you're playing in a league without Max, then sure, I think this is a great build. Also, Red Bull Racing covers the Max Verstappen output, so I think that's a great way of getting a bit of Max without having to get Max himself. Aston Martin intrigues me a lot. Now, I briefly mentioned before that they kept their cards close to their chest in testing. Alonso, I think, is a great and reliable fantasy asset. Stroll, on the other hand, I'm not so sure about. If he's able to maintain that consistency that we saw in the last 6 races of 2023, then he certainly becomes a more viable fantasy asset at that price point. Can he do it a whole season? I don't know if he can. He does come into Bahrain this year with 2 non-broken wrists, so I think that's a tick in his column. But again, I'm really not sure what to expect from Lance Stroll. Fernando Alonso is going to outperform that Aston Martin all the time. And if it looks as good as it did last year or close to that, then podiums are certainly not unattainable for him either. Sonoda, he's been in every single draft I've shown so far, so I think that speaks for himself. Joe, I don't know about him. As I said with Bottas on the previous screen, I think I want to see a bit more from Sauber before I start jumping in on their assets. And I mean, realistically, if you're running this team, for instance, what's to say you couldn't downgrade a Daniel Ricciardo for Lance Stroll and then upgrade Joe to, say, an Alex Albon? I think there's certainly the makings of a very consistent and reliable team, but there are 2 variables in Joe and Stroll which I'm just not so sure about, that maybe probably warrants a little bit more thought if you want to protect the points floor of your team in the first race week of the season. But other than that, I think the team is pretty sound across the board. I'm going to leave that there for now, guys. I know there's probably a lot of talking about different team selections, but hopefully that gives you some ideas as to how to build out your team and, food for thought as to other different combinations you may not have already considered. But I'm going to leave it there for now, guys. As I said, I'll be back with my own team selection video this week as we approach the Bahrain Grand Prix and my final thoughts about 48 hours out from the deadline. So stay tuned for both of those in the lead up to the race weekend. But I'll leave it all there for now, guys. I appreciate you dropping by, and I'll see you all very soon.